Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In this video, we're going to start building our full-fledged GraphQL chat application. So let's first talk about the project we're about to build. It's going to be a real-time chat application built with MERN stack and GraphQL. So let's first of all focus on some of the features that we're trying to accomplish for this application. For the MVP, or the minimum viable product, we're going to try to achieve a sign up as well as sign in and perhaps a reset password functionality. We're going to also work on direct messaging, so one-on-one between two users. We're also going to touch on private group chat, so having two or more users within a single conversation. We'll then work on file sharing, and this could be images, text, and other types of files. And then lastly, we're also going to work on responsive material design. Now, once we accomplish those basic functionalities for an MVP, it would be nice to have a bunch of other features like notifications. It would be also nice to have themes and customizations with user preferences. Maybe also things like status indicators. So for example, when someone is typing, we might display a status for that user. Or perhaps user statuses themselves. So for example, a user could be online, offline, things like that. We might also work on emails, so sending confirmation emails when you finished registering or forgot password functionality when you want to restore your lost password, and some other functionalities as well. Now this is an open question, so if you do have some ideas in mind, leave them down below and we might as well go over them in this project. So let's move on to topics. So there's quite a few technical topics that I'd like us to focus on. The first thing is schema design. So we're going to be following a schema first design. The next topic is user validation, and that's going to be important for security of our application. We're also definitely going to touch on authentication. We're going to talk extensively about session versus token-based authentication approaches. And then we're going to also talk about authorization, so granting users specific permissions and also rejecting access to other permissions that they don't have. We're next going to move on to security, and this is going to be a very important topic for this app. We're going to talk about injections. We're going to talk about different kinds of attacks. So for example, XSS, CSRF attacks, and we're also going to focus a bit on the security headers. On the client side, we're also going to talk about state management. We're going to be using Apollo client, which basically manages all of your data client side in the cache. We're then going to move on to file upload, so being able to upload files like images on the server. We're definitely going to touch on real-time updates with GraphQL subscriptions. We're going to also look into performance optimizations, and this could be at the query level, this could be at the application level as well. And lastly, we might also look into pagination. So instead of returning a full set of results, we're going to try to implement different ways to request a specific subset, for example, of messages or users or other resources. Let's talk about the technologies that we're going to be focusing on for this project. First of all, on the backend, we have Node as well as the Express framework. As far as the data layer, we're going to be using MongoDB as well as the Mongoose ORM. Our GraphQL application layer is going to be built with Apollo Server v2. We're also going to make use of WebSockets, and we might also be using Redis for authentication. There might be other technologies as well, but this might as well change throughout the project. So I'll leave that as an open question as well. And lastly, for the front-end technologies, we're going to be using React 16. We're going to also be using Apollo Client v2, which is the latest client for React. And lastly, we're also going to be using Material UI to develop our responsive user interface. Right, so now that we had a basic overview of the project, let's move on to the coding part. So first of all, we already have a repo. You can find it on GitHub if you go to github.com/alex996/GraphQLChat. So the first thing I would suggest you do is that you go to that repo and you clone it to your local file system. You can just copy that URL and you can paste it in your terminal and do a git clone on that URL. So this is going to clone the repo in its current state so far. I've basically already done that on my side, so I can just switch back to my terminal. I'll show you that I have all the files and I'm also on the master branch as well. So let's go ahead and open this project in Visual Studio Code. And right off the bat, we have this index.js file that sets up a GraphQL server with some basic in-memory database. As I've mentioned in the last video, this way of creating an Apollo server instance is going to instantiate Express framework behind the scenes. So it's actually going to instantiate an HTTP server with the Express framework. Now there's also a different approach to doing this, which is more explicit. So if we go ahead and search for Apollo server, we can go ahead and visit the documentation link. And then in here, I'm going to go to building a server. You can see that there's a middleware section. And this one outlines an alternative way of setting up the server. So instead of using Apollo server package, you could also use Apollo server express, which basically has the same exports, except you would need to call apply middleware on your Apollo server, passing the express instance as the argument in the object. Now we're going to use this approach, and the reason for doing that is, first of all, it's going to allow us for more fine-grained customization. So for example, setting up custom headers or removing some headers. So for example, one of the typical headers that you would like to remove from a production application would be x powered by. In fact, if I go back to the terminal, I'm going to do a yarn watch to show you what I mean by this. Let's go to localhost 4000. Now if I go ahead and open the network tab, so I'm going to fire a query on users. Let's get users by ID. If you inspect the exact response from the server, if you go to the header section, you're going to see that there's an x powered by header on the response object, and this one is set to express. Now this header is one of the headers that you would like to remove from your production application, like I said. Now it kind of becomes difficult if you're using the Apollo server package and if you're instantiating the Apollo server without providing your application instance from Express. It might as well be easier to create your own instance and pass it to Apollo instead. So this way you would have a lot more customization available to you. And the other reason, if we go back to the docs, might be to set up an SSL connection. So for example, if you have your certificates for setting up an HTTPS server, in order to do that, you would need to call the HTTPS module's create server function. Depending on whether SSL is enabled in your app, you're going to need to use a different module. If it is enabled, you're going to need to call HTTPS, which is the built-in module in Node.js. But if it's not enabled, you're going to need to call HTTP, and this is typically used for development. So that's another reason for setting up your own Express instance and then passing it to Apollo server instead of letting it do it by itself implicitly. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back over here. Once again, looking back at the list of dependencies, we have Apollo server and we also have GraphQL. So in order to set up a custom server, I'm going to stop our running server. I'll do a yarn remove of Apollo server. So that's going to remove that dependency. Instead, we're going to do a yarn add of Apollo server express and also express. So the first one is going to be the package for setting up Apollo with Express framework, and the second one is the Express framework itself. Now going back to this index.js file, I'm basically going to remove everything from here. We're basically going to point to source index.js, which is more of a convention that I like to follow. So I'm going to create a source folder. I'm going to paste in an index.js file, and then in here we can basically set up a functional server. So we're going back to this middleware section. Let's go ahead and copy the initial setup from here so we can save up some typing. Now first of all, instead of using CommonJS for require statements, I'd like to use import statements. So what I mean by that is, instead of doing const and then having Apollo server as well as GQL, using a require statement, I'd like to import it from Apollo Server Express using ES6 modules. Now, because ES6 modules are not enabled in Node as of yet, we're going to have to use a library like Babel, for example. And this one is going to allow us to transpile this import syntax back to CommonJS syntax. So this would basically be like sugarcoating for the const require statement that we had before. So even though we would have imports, that code would be transpiled down to require statements. So this is kind of like fooling ourselves because we're actually using CommonJS instead of ES6 modules. Now that's one common way to go about it. Now the other way to do it, if you don't want to set up the whole Babel infrastructure, there's another package that we can look into. I'm going to go to npmjs.org and we can go ahead and search for ESM. ESM is a package that allows you to use ES6 imports and exports in Node.js. And this way you can use it with earlier versions of Node like Node 6. So all we have to do is we need to do an import of ESM library. So going back to the terminal, I'm going to do a yarn add ESM. So once that library is installed, we can basically use import statements safely. Right, so let's go ahead and finish up this file. We're going to new up the Apollo server instance to get rid of those semicolons. And in fact, because you see me working with semicolons, trailing commas, single quotes versus double quotes, this topic goes back to something known as linting. Now, linting is a process of verifying your code against a certain style guide. Because this project is going to be fairly big, I'd like us to be using a linting standard. And the one that I'm passionate about is actually called standard.js. Now, if we look for it, there should be a package. Let me look for standard, and it's going to be the first one popping up, version 12. So that's exactly the one we're looking for. Now, there's quite a few distinctive features about standard. It's a bit different from ESLint. For example, you're going to be using 2 spaces, single quotes, no semicolons, spaces between if conditions, spaces between function names, things like that. Now, linting is useful for keeping your code consistent, and in some cases, it can even help you avoid bugs in your code as well. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to do a yarn add a development dependency of standard. So let's go ahead and do that. And I might have to restart Visual Studio Code, so let me do exactly that. Right, so as you can see, we've got linting enabled right away. And for Visual Studio Code, you might actually have to install a plugin. Now, I already have one installed, and it's actually called standard.js JavaScript standard style. So you can just basically go ahead and install that package or plugin for your editor. And if you're using something like Sublime or Atom, those must also have the same package as well. Now, in my case, I already have it installed, so it seems like linting is already enabled. So what we're going to do next is we're going to import Express from Express. We're going to need to new it up this app constant because right now it's undefined. So let's do Express. Now, the next thing, like I was talking about, we can actually go ahead and disable one of the headers. So for instance, we can go ahead and disable X powered by, and that's going to remove that pesky header from our request. The next thing is that we're missing type definitions and resolvers. So let's actually go ahead and include the import statements for those two. So we're going to have type definitions from type definitions. We're going to have the same one for resolvers. So let me go ahead and do that. All right, so we're going to have to create those 2 folders. So let's do resolvers. We'll create one for type definitions. And we need to remove this trailing column over here. Now, the next thing is we're going to go ahead and do an app listen on port 4000. Now, the port itself, this is one of the things that we'd like to customize or at least make configurable. So in this case, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a const. Let's go ahead and try to extract app port. Basically, this could be called anything. We can call it port. I'm just going to call it app port for clarity. The default value can be 4000, for example. We're going to grab it from process, and now this way you're going to be able to pass environment variables to your script when executing it. So for example, going back to package.json, I'm going to switch from watch to dev just because it's easier to type. But in this case, since we're having a node.mon script, we can go ahead and also pass in something like, let's say, node environment. We can set it to development. We can go ahead and customize the app port to something like 5000, for example, and this will be the perfect place for passing those variables. For now, I'm just going to keep node environment, and going back over here, I'm actually going to also extract it from here. So let's do node environment, and by default, we're going to set it to development like this. Now the application port is going to be used over here to launch your application. Next up, we can also output the URL. So this way we can also paste in the port over here. And this way we can have the full URL to the server. I'm going to remove this GQL from over here because we're not using it. Now, as far as the configuration goes for Apollo server itself, there's one last thing we also need to configure, and this one is called Playground. Now, the playground refers to the GraphQL playground that you see when interacting with the app in development. Basically, in this case, you can pass in an object with options, but you could also pass in a Boolean. Now, this one we actually do need to do. It's working fine in Apollo server, but if you're using Apollo Server Express, there seems to be a bug where you're still able to access the playground in production, but you're not able to execute any queries. But anyhow, to fix this, we're basically going to set the Boolean to node environment. We can check if node environment equals production. And in this case, if the node environment does not equal production, then we want to enable playground. So if we are in prod, this is going to evaluate to false and we won't have any playground. Now, in fact, this could also be a variable on its own. Now I'm going to go ahead and create it. So let's call it in prod. And we're going to put that expression in there, and we're going to use not in prod like this. Next up, let's go ahead and define the schema. So I'm going to create an index.js file in here. We're also going to start with the user schema first. So let's create a basic schema for user. I'm going to do an export default of GQL. We're going to pass in the schema inside. So in here we can have a type query, we can have a type of mutation, and we can have a type of user, like this. Of course, we need to import GQL as well, so let's do that from Apollo Server Express. Now, as you can see, some of these types are actually going to be shared between schemas. So what I mean by that is, for example, we're going to have a schema for a chat, a schema for a message. All of those different schema definitions are going to need to somehow extend the main root types. And this is basically going to allow us to modularize our schema. But to do this is very simple. All we have to do is we need to put in the extend keyword in front of it. Now, this is only going to work if you have a definition for query and mutation. So going back in index, what we can do is we can actually have an import of user from user. And then to export the schema, we could do an export default of an array. And this way we can pass in the user inside. So if we create other schema definitions, so for example, for a message, for a chat, we can also pass in those definitions inside of the array. And this way they're going to be concatenated and served up as a single schema. But like I said, there's one caveat. And the caveat is that we need to create a sort of like a root or parent definition. We need to call GQL, and we basically just need to define the query type. We need to define the mutation type, and that's because we're going to be extending both of them across the different files for defining custom schemas like user or message or chat once again. And because we're also going to be extending the subscription root type, we're going to go ahead and also put subscription in here. So let's do subscription. Now the only caveat here is that all of these root types cannot be empty, so we're going to need to go ahead and put in something inside. So for example, we can put in an underscore, or we can put in like empty or something that's not intended to be used for actual data. So this one can be a string, and we're going to do the same thing for mutation and subscription like this. So this root definition can as well go into its own file. So I'm going to create a root.js file in here. We can go ahead and copy GQL import. I'll put it at the top in here. So actually we can do an export default of that GQL. And once again, this import export syntax is only available to us because of the ESM library. And I don't think I mentioned it, but in order to use this module, we're going to need to use a -r flag from the command line. So let's actually go ahead and look for Node.js command line options. Let's see if we can find it. And for CLI options, we can actually look for require. And this one allows us to require a module before loading up a script. So in order to start the script, we can either use node-r, require the ESM module, and then point to index.js, where we can just basically put a dot. This is going to look for index.js file in the current directory. Or using nodemon, we could do npx nodemon. We can pass in the -r option on the ESM package or library, and then also put in the dot. But even with nodemon, we don't actually have to put in any arguments after that. So let me go ahead and do exactly that back in my editor. For the dav command, I'm going to go ahead and put in nodemon-r ESM like this. So this way we're going to be loading up the ESM package. Right, so going back to our file over here, we've got our root query definitions, and that's perfect. So we can close it up. Back in here, let's do an import of that root file. Let's do import on root. We're going to pass them in to the array like this. Now back in user, we're going to go ahead and create a definition for user. So once again, we're going to have an ID as always. We will also have an email. This would be a required string field. Let's also have a username, a string. It's going to be required. A name, which will also be required, string once again. Let's also have created at, and this one is going to be a string as well. Now, eventually, we're also going to have other types. So for example, we're going to have chats with a chat object, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. We're going to go step by step. So for the time being, we're going to have a simple user schema. And to kick this off, we're going to have a sign up mutation. So this one is going to accept an email, once again, the string, a username, string, and a name as well. So let's do a name string. And this might or might not return a user, because, for example, if you are already logged in, it makes no sense to create a user. So you're probably going to get an exception from the server, or you might get a validation error, or something might as well crash on the server itself. So the user object might or might not be returned. So we're going to keep it as optional for now. Now for the query type, we're going to define a user by ID. We're going to accept an ID and return a user. Once again, this is going to be optional. So I'm not going to put in an exclamation, because if you provide an invalid ID, we're going to have to raise an exception. So this is going to be part of validation. And no worries, we're going to get into that in the upcoming videos. But aside from that, we're also going to have a users query. And this one is going to return an array of user objects. Now, in this case, I'm putting exclamation marks. Once again, we know we've talked about it before, but it's important to emphasize this. The user object inside the array cannot be null, and the array itself cannot be null either. So we have to return at least an empty array. And one last thing I forgot, for the sign up mutation, of course, we also need to pass in a password as well. So this one needs to be a required string. Now, of course, we're not going to have a password on the user type itself, so we're not going to be returning it from the API, but we're going to have to provide it as one of the arguments, because it's going to be stored in the database. And once this is done, let's go ahead and create a resolvers index.js file. And this one is going to be an entry point. So I know I'm going to create a user file, so let's do an import of user from user. This one is going to be user resolver, so let's create that. So this one is going to be an export default of an object. Once again, for a root type resolver, for example, on the query, if we have, let's say, a users resolver, we're going to have the root value, we'll have arguments, context, and then the last one is going to be info. So this will be a function. I'm going to go ahead and copy that. So let's also create one for a user. We're going to also add a key for mutation like this. Let's also create a sign up mutation so that we can go ahead and create users in our database. And that should basically be it. Now in this index.js file, I'm going to do an export default of an array, and I'm going to pass in the user object inside. And now to start the server, we need to go back to our index.js file at the top. This file is going to be loaded by default, so using this dev command, or we could also add a start script for a production build. So for example, we can have a node environment set to production, and we can basically call node on the current directory. And of course, we need to require ESM. And once again, this script is going to be pretty much identical to the dev one, except we're going to be setting the environment to production. And this node environment variable is going to be available in here. So we're destructuring it from process env. And on the same note, it seems like I made a typo over here. Of course, this needs to be a triple equal, because we're checking if the node environment is production. If so, we're setting the in_prod variable to that expression. So actually, let's save the file. And last up, let's go back to our index.js. In here, I'm going to import the contents of the source directory, and this is supposed to go to the index.js file in here. So let's go ahead and back to our terminal. I'm going to do a yarn dev, and this is going to start the playground. So for example, let's open up the network tab. I'm going to try to fire a query. I'm not sure if it's going to work though, because we don't have anything in there yet. And of course, we are getting an error. But at least we can see that the server is working, and on the same note, we are not getting the X powered by header anymore, as you can see.